J.D. Vance stepped onto the brightly lit set of one of America's top talk shows, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the charged tension in the air. Marcus Bennett, the sharp-tongued host, smirked with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. But what happened next would flip the script entirely, leaving the studio and millions watching at home in utter disbelief. Before we dive into this electrifying showdown, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. If you love gripping stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we've got another unforgettable tale waiting for you. The air in Washington, D.C. carried a biting chill that late January evening, the kind that seeped through overcoats and settled into your bones. Snowflakes dusted the streets outside the grand auditorium of Georgetown University, where a crowd had gathered under the glow of chandeliers and the hum of anticipation. It was just 3 weeks since J.D. Vance had taken his oath as Vice President of the United States, his right hand resting on a worn family Bible, his left raised to a nation watching with hope and skepticism. Tonight, he'd been invited to a public forum titled The Future of American Leadership, hosted by the university's political science department. The flyer promised a robust discussion about the new Trump-Vance administration, but the undercurrent of the room told a different story, one of confrontation. J.D. Vance stepped through the double doors, his broad shoulders squared but relaxed, his suit a modest navy that stood out against the sea of tailored tweeds and designer labels worn by the academic elite. His face, weathered slightly by years of hard-earned lessons, carried a quiet confidence, a remnant of his Marine Corps days and the resilience of his Appalachian roots. He nodded politely to the event staff, his breath visible in the cold vestibule before he entered the warmth of the auditorium. The crowd hushed briefly as he took the stage, their eyes flickering between curiosity and suspicion. This wasn't a friendly crowd. These were students and professors, mostly progressive, who'd spent years dissecting power structures and railing against the very administration Vance now represented. At the podium stood Professor Ellen Harper, a wiry woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. Her reputation preceded her, an activist scholar known for her fiery op-eds in the New York Times and her unrelenting critiques of conservative politics. She wore a crimson blazer that seemed to scream defiance, and her thin smile, as she greeted Vance, didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her voice crisp and amplified through the microphone, "we're honored to have you here to discuss your vision, or perhaps your contradictions." A ripple of laughter spread through the audience, mostly from the front rows where her graduate students sat, notebooks in hand ready to dissect every word. Vance returned her smile, unfazed. "Thank you, Professor Harper. I'm looking forward to an honest conversation." His tone was steady, almost warm, but there was a glint in his hazel eyes that suggested he'd walked into tougher rooms than this. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him to read the battlefield, and this auditorium was a battlefield of ideas. He could feel the tension, the way the air thickened with unspoken challenges. Harper's posture, the way she gripped her notes, the faint smirk tugging at her lips, it all signaled an ambush. She wasn't here to discuss policy. She was here to dismantle him, piece by piece, in front of a live-streamed audience of thousands. The room buzzed as Harper launched into her introduction. Tonight, we have the unique opportunity to hear from a man who's worn many hats, author, critic, and now, vice president under a leader he once called unfit for office. She paused for effect, letting the words hang like a guillotine. "Mr. Vance, your journey from Middletown, Ohio to the White House is remarkable, but it raises questions. Questions about integrity, about faith, about loyalty." The audience leaned forward, some nodding, others scribbling furiously. A few students in the back whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of intrigue and disdain. Vance adjusted his stance, hands resting lightly on the podium. He'd expected this. Harper had spent weeks preparing, no doubt poring over his old tweets, his book Hillbilly Elegy, and every interview he'd ever given. She thought she had him cornered, a political chameleon ripe for exposure. But Vance wasn't here to dodge or deflect. He was here to meet her head-on, armed with something she hadn't anticipated, the same unyielding resolve that had carried him through war zones and poverty alike. As Harper's eyes gleamed with the promise of a takedown, Vance took a slow breath. The fight was just beginning. Professor Ellen Harper wasted no time. She straightened her crimson blazer, her fingers brushing the edge of her notes as if they were a weapon she'd sharpened for weeks. "Let's begin with something simple, Mr. Vice President," she said, her voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade. "In 2016, you called Donald Trump an opioid for America's pain. A scathing critique from a man who now stands as his second in command. Tell us, was that a moment of clarity you've since abandoned, or just a convenient stepping stone to power?" The question landed like a grenade and the audience erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs. A few students clapped, their applause sharp and deliberate, egging her on. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He leaned slightly into the podium, his hands steady, his gaze locking with Harper's. "That's a fair place to start, Professor," he replied, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced harder questions in darker places. "Back in 2016, I was looking at the world through a narrow lens. My own experiences, my own frustrations. I saw a country hurting, and I thought I had the measure of the man trying to fix it. But you know what's beautiful about America? It's a place where you're allowed to change your mind when the evidence changes. I did. I met President Trump, saw his actions up close, and realized he was fighting for the same people I wrote about in my book. People like my neighbors in Ohio, forgotten by the elites who'd rather analyze them than help them." The room shifted. A few heads nodded in the back, but Harper's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing. "So, it's growth, then?" she pressed, her tone dripping with skepticism, not opportunism? "Because some might argue, Mr. Vice President, that trading principles for a title isn't growth, it's a transaction." The word transaction hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, and a wave of approving murmurs rolled through the front rows. A young woman in a beret scribbled furiously, her pen practically gouging the paper. Vance tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're welcome to see it that way, Professor, but let me ask you something." He paused, letting the question settle. "Have you ever misjudged someone based on what you read instead of what you saw? I did, and it took character, real character, to admit I was wrong and align myself with a leader I believe in, even when folks like you were waiting to call it a sellout." His words were measured, deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. The audience grew quieter, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances. Harper's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Not yet. She shuffled her notes, her movements brisk. "Let's pivot, then," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You've spoken often about faith, most recently at the National Prayer Breakfast, where you suggested divine guidance has a place in government. Don't you think that's a dangerous line to cross in a secular nation, or is this just another convenient cloak for policies that favor your base?" The accusation was a gauntlet thrown down, and the room tensed. A man in the third row muttered "Amen" under his breath, while a cluster of students near the aisle rolled their eyes. Vance straightened, his expression softening but his eyes sharpening. "You're misquoting me a bit there, Professor, but I'll bite," he said, his tone still even. "What I said was that our founding fathers understood moral guidance, call it faith if you want, grounds leadership in something bigger than power grabs. I learned that from my mama back in Middletown, Ohio. She'd pray over a half-empty table, not because she wanted a theocracy, but because she knew hope and decency don't come from Washington. They come from something deeper." He paused, letting the story sink in. "When I took my oath, I put my hand on that same Bible she gave me. Not to impose a religion, but to honor the values that kept us going when the world wrote us off." A ripple of applause broke out, tentative at first, then louder. Harper's face flushed, her fingers tightening around her notes. "A charming anecdote," she shot back, her voice edged with sarcasm. "But in a diverse society, leaning on faith like that alienates millions. Surely you see the hypocrisy, claiming to represent the forgotten while clinging to traditions that exclude?" She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with the certainty of a checkmate. Vance raised a hand, a subtle gesture for patience. "Let me finish this thought, because it matters," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "Faith doesn't exclude, it binds. In the Marines, I saw guys from every background, atheists, Christians, you name it, bow their heads together before a mission, not because they all believed the same thing, but because they trusted something bigger than themselves. That's not hypocrisy, Professor. That's America." The applause swelled again, this time from deeper in the room, and a few students who'd been skeptical began to shift in their seats. Harper wasn't done. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice rising. "And what about your loyalty to Trump? You once called him a demagogue, Now you're his right hand. Is that faith too, or just blind allegiance to a man your own party once feared? The question was a dagger, and the room held its breath. A few boos rang out, quickly drowned by cheers from her supporters. Vance met her gaze, unflinching. "You want to talk loyalty? Let's talk about it," he said, his voice steady as steel. "I don't follow men blindly. Not Trump, not anyone. I follow results. I've seen him fight for the people you claim to champion. People you've never met because you're too busy lecturing from ivory towers like this one." He gestured faintly at the chandeliered ceiling, and a gasp rippled through the crowd. "You want to know why I stand with him? Because he's delivered. Jobs, hope, dignity, for the folks you'd rather pity than empower." The auditorium erupted, a chaotic mix of cheers and jeers. Harper's composure faltered, her lips parting as she scrambled for a retort. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her notes trembling slightly in her hands. Vance stood tall, his calm unshaken, as the confrontation spiraled toward its peak. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning, and Harper knew it. The auditorium at Georgetown University pulsed with raw energy, a cacophony of cheers and jeers colliding like storm clouds over the stage. Professor Ellen Harper stood at the edge, her crimson blazer a stark contrast to her paling face as she clutched her notes, her earlier confidence fraying at the edges. J.D. Vance remained rooted at the podium, his navy suit unrumpled, his expression a blend of calm resolve and quiet intensity. The air crackled as Harper's last jab, blind allegiance, hung unanswered, a challenge that demanded a response. The audience leaned forward, some with clenched fists, others with wide eyes, all sensing the debate had reached a tipping point. Harper seized the moment, her voice rising to reclaim control. "You speak of results, Mr. Vice President, but let's be honest," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Your loyalty to Trump, a man you once labeled a demagogue, a destroyer of democratic norms, looks less like principle and more like a calculated bet. He's no savior of the forgotten. He's a wrecking ball to the institutions that protect them. How do you square that with the dignity you claim to champion?" Her words were a battering ram, and her supporters roared their approval, a wave of applause crashing from the front rows. A young man in a hoodie pumped his fist, shouting, "Tell him, Professor." Vance didn't blink. He stepped away from the podium, closing the distance between himself and Harper, not aggressively, but with the steady gait of a man who'd walked through fire before. "You want to talk about squaring things, Professor?" he said, his voice low but piercing, cutting through the noise like a rifle shot. "Let's start with your definition of democratic norms, because right now, you're standing here trying to shout me down, to twist my words into something they're not. Is that your idea of democracy? Silencing anyone who doesn't fit your script?" The question landed like a thunderclap, and the room stilled, the cheers faltering into an uneasy murmur. Harper's eyes flashed, but Vance pressed on, his tone unwavering. "You call Trump a wrecking ball, fine. But maybe some things need wrecking, like a system that's left entire towns in Ohio and Appalachia to rot, while folks like you sip lattes and write papers about their plight. I've seen what he's done, not what you say he's done. Jobs coming back, factories humming again, people who'd given up hope buying groceries without a calculator. That's not a wrecking ball. That's rebuilding." A few claps broke out, tentative at first, then bolder, rippling from the back, where students less tethered to Harper's orbit sat. She bristled, stepping forward to meet him. "Rebuilding?" she snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "You're cherry-picking anecdotes to prop up a man who thrives on division. I've spent my career fighting for the marginalized. Immigrants, minorities, the working poor. Where were you when they needed a voice?" Her accusation was a lifeline to her unraveling narrative, and her loyalists rallied, their applause a desperate attempt to drown out the shifting tide. Vance's gaze hardened, but his voice stayed steady, a quiet steel threading through it. "Where was I? I was in Middletown, watching my mamaw stretch a can of soup to feed 3 kids. I was in Iraq, praying with my squad before a patrol, not caring who they voted for. And I was writing Hillbilly Elegy, trying to tell the world about the people you claim to fight for. People you've never met because you're too busy studying them from a lecture hall." He paused, letting the words sink in. "So let me ask you, Professor, When's the last time you sat down with a coal miner's daughter or a factory worker's son? Not to interview them, but to listen. Because I have, and they're not asking for your pity, they're asking for a chance. The auditorium fell silent, a stunned hush swallowing the last echoes of applause. Harper's lips parted, but no sound came. Her notes slipped slightly in her hands, a faint tremor betraying her. Vance turned slightly, addressing the crowd directly for the first time. "You see, that's the difference here," he said, his voice carrying a raw, unpolished honesty. "I don't just talk about the forgotten. I've lived their lives. And when I met President Trump, I didn't see a demagogue. I saw a man who'd sit with those same people, hear their stories, and actually do something about it. Not because it's popular in rooms like this, but because it's right." A single clap broke the silence, then another, until a swell of applause rose from the back, spreading unevenly through the room. Harper's face reddened, her composure cracking as she scrambled to respond. "That's a nice story," she said, her sarcasm strained, "but it doesn't change the facts. Trump's policies, your policies, hurt the very people you claim to represent. Tariffs that raise prices, tax cuts for the rich. How is that doing something?" She flung the words like a lifeline, but they landed weaker than before, her voice drowned by the growing unrest in the crowd. Vance smiled faintly, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Facts? Let's talk facts," he said, stepping closer still. "You're so busy tearing down what we're building that you've missed what's happening. Those tariffs, they've brought steel jobs back to Youngstown. Those tax cuts, they've put money in pockets in places like Dayton, not just Wall Street. But you wouldn't know that, would you? You're too focused on winning arguments to see the people winning their lives back." He turned to the audience again. "Ask yourselves, who's really out of touch here?" The room exploded, a chaotic mix of cheers, boos, and shouted questions. Harper's hands shook as she tried to shout over the din. "That's not—" But her words were lost. A young woman in the front stood, clapping fiercely, while a man near the aisle yelled, "Let him finish!" Vance stood motionless, his calm a stark contrast to the storm he'd unleashed. Harper's carefully laid trap had collapsed, and the momentum had shifted irrevocably into his hands. The climax had arrived, and the professor's grip on the narrative was slipping through her fingers like sand. The Georgetown University auditorium had become a tempest, a swirling chaos of voices clashing like waves against a crumbling shore. J.D. Vance stood at the center of it, his navy suit a quiet anchor amid the storm, his face serene yet resolute. Professor Ellen Harper, her crimson blazer now slightly askew, gripped the edge of her podium, as if it were the last tether to her unraveling authority. The audience was a fractured mosaic, some cheering Vance's defiance, others shouting in defense of Harper's faltering stance. Her last attempt to regain footing had drowned in the uproar, and now she raised her hands, signaling for quiet. "Enough," she barked, her voice hoarse but commanding. "Let's wrap this up with some clarity." She straightened, smoothing her notes with a trembling hand, and launched into what she clearly intended as her closing salvo. "Mr. Vice President," she said, her tone icy with regained composure, "you paint a rosy picture of your administration's work, but it's a facade. Your policies, Trump's policies, are a threat to progress, to equity, to the communities I've spent decades defending. You stand here preaching about the forgotten, but you're just another cog in a machine that grinds them down. This isn't about hope, it's about power." Her words were a rallying cry, and her supporters erupted, their applause a desperate lifeline to her fading narrative. Vance opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a new voice cut through the din. A young man's, rough-edged and unsteady, rising from the back of the room. "Excuse me, Professor Harper, but can I say something?" The auditorium fell silent, head swiveling toward the source. A lanky figure in a faded flannel shirt stood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face flushed with nervous determination. Harper blinked, caught off guard. "This is a moderated discussion," she snapped. But the young man pressed on, undeterred. "My name's Tyler Grayson," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I grew up in Pikeville, Kentucky, Appalachia, same as Mr. Vance, and I've got a story you need to hear. The room held its breath, and Vance's eyes softened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Tyler stepped into the aisle, his boots scuffing the polished floor. 2 years ago, I pitched a project to your foundation, Professor. Solar panels for my town. We've got no jobs, no power half the time, and I thought it'd help. He turned it down, said, "It didn't fit your progressive vision. Too small, too rural, not flashy enough for your donors." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Harper's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I don't recall," she stammered, but Tyler wasn't finished. "I've got the rejection email right here," he said, pulling out his phone and holding it up. Dated March 12, 2023. "You didn't even meet with me, but last week I got a call from the vice president's office. They're funding it, full budget, no strings, starts next month." He turned to Vance, his voice cracking. "Thank you, sir. That's my home you're saving." The auditorium erupted again, but this time the cheers drowned out the boos. Harper staggered back, her notes slipping to the floor, her eyes darting to the exits as if seeking escape. Vance stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "Tyler, come up here," he said gently. The young man hesitated, then climbed the steps, standing awkwardly beside the vice president. Vance rested a hand on his shoulder. "This is what I'm talking about," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Not speeches, not debates, action. I didn't come here to win an argument with you, Professor. I came to make sure kids like Tyler don't get forgotten again." The room was a mix of stunned silence and scattered applause. Harper, her face a mask of disbelief, muttered, "This is irrelevant," but her words were swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd. Vance turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping the sea of faces. "I'll leave you with this," he said. "I don't measure success by who I can out-talk. I measure it by who I can lift up. That's all." With that, he nodded to Tyler, and the two walked off the stage together, leaving Harper alone under the harsh lights. As the doors closed behind them, the audience buzzed, some whispering about Tyler's revelation, others staring at Harper, who stood frozen, her grand finale reduced to a hollow echo. The truth had turned the night upside down, and no one had seen it coming. The story of J.D. Vance's clash with Ellen Harper offers profound lessons about integrity, empathy, and the power of action over words. Vance's unwavering calm in the face of hostility teaches us that true strength lies not in shouting louder, but in standing firm in our convictions. His ability to turn the debate from a personal attack into a broader dialogue about real people like Tyler reminds us to look beyond ourselves and focus on those who need help most. In life, we often face critics who judge us by our past or question our motives. Instead of retreating, we can choose to respond with authenticity, using our experiences to bridge divides rather than widen them. Harper's downfall, sparked by Tyler's unexpected truth, underscores the danger of prioritizing ideology over humanity. It's a call to listen, truly listen, to others, especially those we claim to represent. In our own lives, this means acting with humility, supporting others not for applause, but because it's right. Vance's final act, lifting Tyler up, shows that real impact comes from quiet deeds, not grand debates. Let's live with purpose, valuing people over arguments, and building a world where no one is forgotten.